Selecting the topics for these recordings hasn't been an easy task, but I've been guided in the selection by some of the questions that typically are asked by the magicians who attend the seminars that I've conducted. I began doing small seminars in January of 1983, I suppose in large part because I had lost faith in the educational value of the traditional magic lecture format, which encourages a lecturer to give a performance instead of encouraging serious exploration and thinking about magical questions. Over the years, I've conducted more than 100 seminars in America and Europe for groups of usually a dozen or so magicians. I begin by explaining that in a lecture, I get to talk about whatever I choose, but in a small group, we can talk about whatever you choose. I then give everyone some time to think and write down the questions that they would like discussed. Some of the questions are about specific effects or magical techniques, such as forcing or card controls. But most of the questions, interestingly, are concerned with much more provocative topics, such as uncovering our character, or ways of approaching people in close-up magic, or dealing with ways of different and difficult audience members, or questions that concern the business side of magic. And almost always, one topic appears with surprising regularity, and that topic is creativity. Most serious magicians want to be more creative with their magic. They don't want simply to be imitators. Most serious magicians would like to do something magically that is special, even unique, but they feel blocked in these creative endeavors. And the harder one tries to become creative through an act of willpower or conscious effort, the more blocked we seem to become. And so we ask, how can we become more creative with our magic? Is this your question too? May I ask you, is this a serious question for you? An important question, a question whose answer you urgently desire? Or is this merely a passing question, a question whose answer you would only store in your head for use sometime later? The problem with later, of course, is that it exists only in the head and not in reality. I am convinced that some of the questions in life require a sense of urgency if they are to be answered at all. And so I ask you, do any of these magical questions fill you with a sense of urgency, a deep desire that you find the answer so that you can get on with your magic and grow? Or are these simply interesting, but ultimately unimportant questions? Questions whose answer really wouldn't make much difference in your life anyway. As I said on the first recording, whether you agree with me or disagree with me is rather unimportant. I'm asking questions, and I'm giving my answers to them. I sometimes think of my writings, and even of these recordings, as spiritual autobiography, wherein I tell you how I have personally answered some of the big questions about magic and magic performance. I would, therefore, find it rather depressing if you were simply to agree with me. The questions that we've been asking on these recordings in the last analysis are questions for you to answer in your own way, according to your own experience and insight. My aim has been to raise a variety of questions that I think deserve the reflection of all of us who love the art of magic. So, how can I become more creative with my magic? Where shall I begin? Since most magical knowledge is transmitted to us via the printed word, and now the audio and videotape, the first thing I can do is not do what the book or tape says. Sometimes I might try doing what the book or tape says not to do and see what happens. Just because something is in a book doesn't make it true. With magic books even, it doesn't always mean that the author can perform the material. In the big picture, everybody doing what the book says produces a sameness and monotony that not only begins to affect our audiences, but also affects us. If I'm just doing what everybody else is doing, if I'm not growing, then I become affected by the sameness and monotony that I see all around me. And thereby, I begin reinforcing those feelings that I am a dull and uncreative person. And yes, I do think that audiences also get this sense of monotony, that magic is all pretty much the same. I'm reminded of a story told to me a few years ago in Seattle by my friend Kirk Charles. Kirk was in the audience watching a magic show, and there was a young girl about 10 years old sitting next to him. As one of the acts on the bill began their substitution trunk routine, an effect that the audience had just seen an earlier act on the bill perform, the little girl looked up at Kirk and said, "Do we have to watch it all again?" You know, I often ask myself that very question when I watch magic shows at magic conventions. The truth is, so long as I am doing what the book says, saying what the book says to say, I am being uncreative and dull. That is the fact of it. And so if I want to start becoming creative, it seems to me that one place to begin is with those books I've been reading, and with the routines that I'm trying to learn from them. Try doing something different and see what happens. You might fall flat on your face. On the other hand, you might discover things that are of deep and personal value for your magic and also for you as a performer of magic. My own view, and I suppose it's slightly subversive, is that many of us turn to books in the first place because we do want to be more creative, and we simply don't know where else to turn. And we've been taught, conditioned our entire lives to turn to books for answers. I think that books can stimulate ideas, but I seriously doubt that we get many important answers from them. An author can stimulate us to think, even to think in new ways, but if there are going to be any important answers for us, these will have to be provided by us. And that means that you will need to begin exploring your own imagination and your own dreams. How little in our culture do we cultivate our imagination? We treat the imagination as if it were a poor relative of the rational mind, a somewhat distracting side journey on the larger, logical journey of life. And yet, when we look at it, we realize that through the centuries, most of the important discoveries and innovation in art, religion, and even science were generated not so much by logical, rational, step-by-step thinking, as by intuition, sudden flashes of insight, and imagination. Well, as magicians, how do we cultivate our imaginations? The answer is that we need to begin to practice, the art of allowing visual images to form in our mind. The simplest approach is to lie down on a sofa or bed, close your eyes, and start imagining. And that indeed is the heart of the work. For these periods of cultivating the imagination to be effective and into nap time, one needs to understand that for this even to be real inner work, it must be both regular and conscious. By regular, I mean that I need to set aside a certain period of time for this cultivating of my imagination every day, though I need not become a slave to this and feel that everything will fall apart if I miss a day. It might be 5 minutes, or 10 minutes, or whatever you decide. It is less important how long you decide to do this each day, and much more important that you do decide, that you decide to begin. When I say this needs to be conscious, I mean that before I begin each day's session, I must decide in my mind what area I'm going to allow my imagination to roam. I might, for example, spend many sessions imagining my opening in a performance. I might imagine the audience. Someone gives me an introduction. I'm introduced and I walk out. And what? What happens? What do I do? What do I say? The possibilities are endless, aren't they? During this work, in cultivating my imagination, I don't need to make any concrete decisions about my actual magical work. That can all come much later. Here, I'm simply concerned with letting my imagination flow, without me getting in the way. At first, of course, you may feel awkward or even a little ill at ease. That will pass. Sometimes at first, your imagination seems to go blank. That too passes once you realize that you can't really force anything, and so you might as well relax and see what happens. Working with our imaginations calls into question the value of willpower, tension, and conscious effort as real aids to creativity. The truth seems to be that most of us simply can't sit down and through an act of willpower or conscious effort make ourselves creative. And gritting our teeth and getting tense doesn't help much either. What is needed is a calm and relaxed and receptive state, a state of openness, a state of listening and waiting and seeing for ourselves what our imagination creates. I suppose that for many contemporary magicians, these ideas about nurturing our imagination are almost like being invited to visit another planet. It isn't surprising that these kinds of thoughts and ideas are so alien to modern conjuring, caught up as it is with tricks and moves and methods. Yet the truth is, working with our imagination and with our powers of inner visualization, this has always been part of the magician's inner training from the very dawn of magic. This means that magicians have always needed to make a decision, to take time out of life's busy schedule to explore and empower their own imaginations through conscious and regular inner work. This has always been part of the way of the magician, even if modern magicians, traveling on the road of forgetfulness, fail to realize it. cultivating our imagination finally helps us realize the value of solitude, of spending time alone, working with our magic for the sheer delight and joy of it. I believe that great magicians always have been born out of these moments of solitude. For me, then, if I were to sum it all up for you, the way of magic is not so much the way of learning magic tricks. That any monkey can do. No, the way of magic, rather, is the way of slow movement along a path of growing and learning to be a magician.